All right. With that, thank you all for your help in the set change. For that, I'd like to welcome our next round of guests up to the table. So if I could have panelists come on up. And we're going to hear from this part of the program. We're going to hear from some entrepreneurs who are currently pursuing some dual-use commercial pathways for their startups, so they can share some of their experiences with you today. There we go. Great. So I'm really excited about this portion of the program. Stories, the war stories especially, are really what sell. So I want to encourage you all to share the good and the bad, and really again, the bad's good because it really shows why we need HJF, right? So if we could just go through and introduce yourself, your company, the technology you're working on, and we'll just kind of start down the line here. Start with you, Mustafa.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for having us and me here. My name is Chibueze Ihenacho, or Chibs. I'm CEO and founder of ARMR Systems. So we're a proud TEDCO company, and we were poached from the Boston area many years ago. But ARMR, our mission and mandate is to save lives. So what we do is develop first of its kind wearable that treats traumatic hemorrhage anytime, anywhere. Essentially what we've built, we've taken traditional pre-hospital trauma tools and changed the form factor from metals and plastics to clothes. So we asked the question, what if every soldier could be a medic? It's a big idea, right? We're building the Swiss Army knife, the EpiPen, the AED for trauma and bleed out, which is a leading cause of death and leading a number, pretty big need in the pre-hospital, military, medical, and global health world. My background very quickly, stop talking. I'm a biomedical engineer by training and clinical researcher, but also a victim and survivor of a traumatic car accident, right? So I come to this from the civilian perspective, but with a deep appreciation of the mission and mandate to save lives.
Thanks. First, I want to start off by saying thanks to Chris, for obviously organizing this event, and the Henry M. Jackson Foundation for hosting us today. We're all appreciative for it. My name is Matt Pietras. I'm the CEO and CFO of On-Demand Pharmaceuticals. The name is just exactly as it would imply. We produce medications at the point of care at the time of need. The mission of the organization is to be the world's most reliable provider of quality medications as a service. And there's a lot of components to that. Just for a brief introduction to the company and how it was founded, I am not its founder. Dr. Jeff Ling is its founder. Anybody here know Dr. Jeff Ling? Outstanding innovator. What Jeff realized, he was a battlefield surgeon and operating for the Armory in the forefront of where care was needed most in the early 2000s. And he found himself in a number of circumstances where the drug he needed wasn't available. And you can go onto YouTube, search Dr. Jeff Ling, and watch him talk about why he discovered, founded, and developed the platform that On-Demand Pharmaceuticals is now working to commercialize. But he had identified that if he had very binary starting ingredients and a core chemistry set, he can produce just about any medication that he would need at the battlefront at the point of time and at the point of care. And so with that notion, when Dr. Ling had retired from the Army, he had gone on to DARPA, and with this battlefield medicines notion and idea, brought it forward, but not really fully evolved in its concept for how he would deliver it. And that's really where the military had supported so much of our innovation. We basically come up with the Keurig and the K-Cup for medicine production for sterile injectable medicines. I can speak for an hour about this alone. I'm not going to take all that time. I'm going to answer questions later. But by way of my background, I'm probably the only one here who can do your taxes and talk a little bit about cellular biology at the same time. I've got a CPA. I started in public accounting at KPMG. I spent a decade in banking, all for the love of learning about the biotech industry. I completed 2 master's degrees at Johns Hopkins. One was in cell biology. The other one was an MBA specific to the industry because I want to see businesses thrive in this sector. When I completed those degrees, I went on to AstraZeneca. I led oncology from a finance perspective for a number of years. I spun Viela Bio out, led that for its the preparation of its IPO. It ultimately went, and then I just got bitten by the startup bug. And this is the first company I've been at that's a dual use company. And so many of the war stories, to your point, Chris, are different than any other type of innovation I've ever seen before. There's multiple different threads that not only promote but threaten the viability of what you're trying to develop. And so I'm looking forward to this panel just as much as you guys are.
Hi, my name is Mustafa, and I'm the CEO and founder of Astek Diagnostics. I have a PhD in biomedical engineering. Well, my background was working on a project called Medicine on Demand, funded by DARPA, that later became ODP. So it's a crazy small world. And around the time that I was graduating, my grandfather developed a urinary tract infection, and just watching him being in pain, the delirium that he had, just watching physicians scrambling to figure out what antibiotic he should be taking, it kind of made me realize that I need to start a company kind of addressing 1 hour antibiotic sensitivity testing. So I got in touch with our friends at Titco, and they funded me even though I had not graduated yet. So by the time I graduated, I actually had a check from Titco to build the first prototype, and then, you know, that's where we started. Just quick background, I'm from Iraq. I was a refugee for 6 years, and as a refugee, I built a company called Ajax. I was not allowed to get a job because I was a refugee, but I had a scholarship to study engineering. So I worked for this company that did market research, and they did not understand the Iraqi dialect while I did. So what I did was I built a software to go from Iraqi dialect into English directly, and then later to German, and they ended up buying that company. And for me, that was the ticket out of my refugee status. I came to the US and did my PhD. So in a way, Astek is my second startup, but it's the first startup that was incorporated and had a bank account.
Which every startup hopes for.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. I appreciate everyone, you know, talking about your founding story. And so it sounds like, you know, you two had a kind of a military application in mind at the beginning, but not you, Mustafa. So maybe could you share, how did you discover that there was this dual use path that you could take your company down? Because I'm sure, like, you start off with a commercial approach.
Mm-hmm. Well, so just like any other company that, you know, we need to talk to customers, go around, discover your beachhead market. And we're talking to an investor who said, you know, let me introduce you to my sister who's been working with patients with neurogenic bladder syndrome. So these patients usually have a spinal cord injury and they have no control over their bladder. From there, we started talking to these patients. And what we realized was 80% of these patients actually were military veterans that had that. And from there, we realized that so many servicewomen actually were getting UTIs that were hard to treat in the field. And then, you know, I presented at Henry Jackson Foundation, and someone came up to me after my presentation and said, hey, I work with many patients that have injuries and they have trauma, and we want to make sure that their injuries are not infected before we operate. And that's how we kind of started addressing that issue with, we started working with wound effluent. So it's kind of like started by a customer conversation, ended up with a whole new sample set that we started working with.
What about you guys? Matt, you were the founder, of course, but like, you started with a military approach. Did you, through that process, discover a commercial approach, or?
It was necessary.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know how familiar the audience might be with respect to drug shortages, but drug shortages affect predominantly generic drugs. 90% of the drugs we rely upon every day are generics. 10% are branded therapeutics. And the reality is drug shortages continue to be an issue because the supply chain is consistently constrained, whether economically or socially or politically, or even, you know, natural storms and events. We had a Hurricane Helene took out a Baxter plant last year and left saline and parenterals, you know, basically on their back. We couldn't get access to either. And so for us, what we identified was, yes, there was, you know, obviously a soldier's need. What soldiers needed is a variety of different medications that could be carried into the field that wouldn't expire. The beauty of our, what we call a PARS pack, which is like the K-cup that goes in a Keurig, pre-assembled raw material sequence package, is that it's shelf stable for years, if not decades. You know, a lot of emphasis recently has been placed on the national stockpile of our active pharmaceutical ingredients. That's only helpful to a certain extent because then you need fill finishers. Whereas our PARS pack, it provides for that form that you would need to compound or produce those medications whenever they were needed. And so our emphasis did start with, the soldiers in the battlefield, and it's still applicable there. However, it's more relevant for the broader market in a variety of different places and ways. Right now, we are focused specifically on generic sterile injectables on the drug shortage list because we're going to do compounding. In time, we're working on becoming a CDMO and a CMO where we could produce the next wave of therapeutic innovation, whether it's a biologic or a personalized therapeutic. But right now we're starting with the lowest hanging fruit to establish a national infrastructure of distributed manufacturing facilities. Why that's important is because it resolves single point failures. And these are small modular facilities that, you can put on an island chain or you can put in a city center. They can be started up very quickly and they can be shut down very quickly. They can sit idle as long as the GMP manufacturing environment is maintained. So there's a lot of agility that comes in a solution like this. I will tell you, we've been raising capital for the better part of a year now. And having been in this industry now for over 25 years, this is the hardest market I have ever seen for a technology that is commercializable right now. We ran a pilot in 2024 where we produced 12,000 units of medication at the point of care across 7 different drugs in North Mississippi at North Mississippi Hospital System. And at the conclusion of that pilot, the hospital was ready to roll. We couldn't raise the capital necessary to launch it. We moved to a government contract to do something else for a little while we went out and canvassed and raised capital. And it's been challenging. It's been very eye-opening because, one of the things that you have to realize is when you're in this circumstance where it is dual use, neither the public sector nor the private sector wants to go first.
Yeah.
The private investors are saying, well, we'll come in when the government puts a little bit more in. And the government's saying, hey, we put in the development, now it's time. And you're kind of stuck. For us, I liken it to, everybody talks about the valley of death and how you're going to cross it. Well, we're walking on a tight wire that's getting thinner and thinner and thinner as we take every sequential step, and it's terrifying.
Was that similar for you, Chibs? Like, are you going through? I hear you laughing down there. You're going through a similar from the investor landscape.
Well, we've been, so ARMR, we've had the privilege, I guess, of surviving 11 winters as a dual use startup, right? So there are many stories and seasons I can speak to. The laugh was, I think as we're raising capital as well, and we have been able to raise capital in the past, and we're currently doing so, but everyone's first to be second or last, and which is fair. I mean, if I was an investor, it's about risk mitigation. And so I understand that, but of course it's to the detriment of brilliant entrepreneurs and kind of game-changing ideas. But I think our origin story, that you have the perfect spectrum here. I was kind of tricked into this, so I was on the way to medical school to be as smart as this panel. And basically our design was seen by a couple of emergency care physicians in the Atlanta area where I'm from Georgia Tech. And, over a couple months, I was doing research elsewhere. This was seen by the medical director of Fort Hood, a 3-star from Mississippi, a 2-star from Atlanta, another 2-star. And then finally we got a call from Green Beret unit who said, hey, we're going to be in Romania in a couple of weeks and we have some. And it didn't exist, right? And so we were kind of pulled into it, but that's been the story. That's how which I like that way because, our foundation has always been around the need. We always say our job is to meet the need, and particularly for pre-hospital bleed out and care, we want to be able to take the technology to the bleeding edge. When a soldier or a fighter feels they're forgotten, they're injured, they are by themselves. And so that's been our genesis is, there is a huge need. And we know this again from the civilian perspective, from the global health perspective. That's kind of my first love, is understanding, hey, I'm Nigerian American. So when we go back to Nigeria, if you get in a motorbike accident or a car accident and you're in the wrong place, you will die. It could be, I know a buddy who, very minor accident here would not have been an issue, but over 7 hours, they bled to death because the nearest hospital, with bad roads was 10 hours away, So in terms of the spectrum, that's kind of how we started. And also, folks know the internet, but that used to be DARPANET, right? And a lot of the innovations in emergency medicine have come from the military. There's no other environment as austere. I mean, it's a terrible, wonderful engineering problem where it's small, light, cheap, invincible, usable at a second grade level. I mean, it needs to be, it's just a tremendous kind of engineering problem. So we find naturally that the influence cascade, as it were, to prove out a trauma emergency care device, you got to go into these environments. You don't prove that out by starting at urgent care facility in Bethesda. Just not how it works.
So let's build on that. So when you're pursuing a military or DoD technology, just like Mustafa shared his experience, like you have to get customer requirements, right? That's part of growing a startup. Like, what is the customer want? Troy talked about it, right? One of his S's. How do you do that with a military? I mean, there's got to be another layer of challenge there, I would assume. I mean, can you guys share some of like, what are the challenges of trying to get those customer requirements when you're talking about DoD? I mean, I think DoD or DOW, whatever you call it, and I just think of like top secret clearances, and I think of like you can't just cold call a 2-star general and be like, hey, can I show you this new technology?
I'd love to start that because it goes back to Troy's comments. I mean, community. So coming out of snot-nosed 21-year-old out of Georgia Tech, not from military family. I know nothing. I have no money. I'm a Nigerian American. I go to church and I go to school. I mean, like, I don't know anything, right? So what it was community. We did in the first couple months, we did over 700 interviews where if a vet knew a vet knew a vet, I would talk to all of them, right? So it was simply talking to the guys, talking to the warfighter, and then they started throwing us over the fence, as they say, right? So I think for those who are interested in anything in the dual use, everything begins with the requirement. Is there a requirement? Is there a need? I think there has to be a need at 2 levels. There's the human common sense need. Units have needs. Things are happening in the field, beyond the wire. Things happen, as they say. There's a phrase about that. But is it a real problem that, anecdotally, folks can relate to your customers or warfighters? And then I think from a programmatic, contractual, level, is that need recognized, or is there a path to have that need recognized at scale? So I think that is, for anyone, wandering into these waters, I think be very cognizant of the need, and it helps because it requires you to humble yourself and, really, truly just be an ear for the community. And fortunately, I had no experience, no money. I wasn't in the military, so my ego was pretty small back then. And so all we could do was listen to the need, right? And that guided how we moved. But I think it's critically important in the dual use space to understand the importance of requirements if you want, I think, to scale the support and scale the value within this community.
Yeah, so at Astek, we have about $30 million in contracts, some of them military. And 2 things really helped me get in touch with military personnel. One is going to events where, like you see someone fit because someone is presenting about it, and that's, just approach them directly. And the second thing that worked for us is looking at military hospitals where they're more willing to talk to you about these problems because they have a research arm or something like that you can go directly and talk scientist to scientist or business person to business person. And, so these 2 ways, that's how we got to sign some of these contracts.
I guess I would just add, we have to think about it in the context of 2 different communities. For us, clearly the need was born out of a military need, and Dr. Ling, brought his platform and his technology to DARPA, and the Battlefield Medicines program was born. And that had a very specific and important outcome. But the way in which we continue to generate, contracts and grants through the government is performing on those contracts, right? So first and foremost, there's a lot of contracts you can apply for, and you hope to get them, but you also have to be aware that you have to have the team in place to perform on those projects. We've been very fortunate that over $100 million of different government contracts we've been able to secure and complete, and each one of them have successfully contributed some element to the platform. But I'll be the first one to tell you that the platform that we've conceived in distributed manufacturing, framework A lot of the innovations that we've come up with, like the Keurig itself that we use, I use that term because it's relatable, but it's called an income fill. It's an integrated compounding and filling device. That thing was never paid for by any government-sponsored project. That was through our investors based on all that we learned from the government contracts. And why was that important? Is because the government wasn't contracting for us to come up with a distributed manufacturing platform, even though we knew that was the answer. They were asking us to come up with manufacturing methods to produce either the API or the finished drug product for a variety of things. We knew the broader applicability would be for that to be, not only manufactured in a certain way, but then made shelf stable and ready for use, right? And so I talk about it in the context of the two communities because the government still wants to fund projects that are a little bit aside of where we see the commercial landscape moving and the need. And so the way in which we talk to investors and to hospital systems is specifically, about the quantification of those things that are right now unquantifiable. And what I mean by that is, you can take a vial that you can purchase from a wholesaler or a 503B, and it might be $1 or it might be $12, but it's not $25 each and every time. Some of them are $80, right? It just depends on what you're purchasing, which drug. Our solution is intended to be a stably priced vehicle so that when drug shortages occur, there aren't any spikes. Sit shelf stable, ready to be used whenever you want it. And so it's approaching that market in a way that answers a problem that the commercial market needs and wants and at an agreed upon price, right? So like we had to take this innovation that was conceived for one platform, mold and shift it. And, there's something you said earlier about people, passion, plan, and profitability. We were always gifted with the people and the passion, but the plan and the profitability was probably the hardest thing we had to solve. And we did. Over the course of the last year, we put together a pretty robust business plan. We went out and we pressure tested it among, community hospitals and got their buy-in as to, okay, well, here's what we would want on the formulary. Here's what we would need all the time. I don't know how familiar you guys are, but there was an oncology drug, cisplatin, that went on drug shortage 2 years ago in 2023. And there were patients who were diagnosed with cancer that couldn't get first-line therapy. It happens every day. We don't see it because it happens behind the curtain. But the reality is that drug shortages are a problem, not only for the supply chain reasons, but the quality issues that lead to those supply chain issues, or even natural occurring events like hurricanes and earthquakes. And so it's talking to that consumer base about, how does this solution help you to augment the risks that you're trying to output? And it's not dollar for dollar, right? It's like I said earlier, if you try to compare $1 for this vial versus what we're producing, we're never going to win that battle. But where we are going to win is that agility. Where we are going to win is that you don't have to have somebody on staff constantly searching, where are we going to source these drugs when they become short? And if they're not, how we're going to ration. The last thing you want to do is make a patient more vulnerable because you don't have the right medication to treat them. And so that value proposition is evolving. It's not the same as what the military needs, right?
Yeah, I think you hit on a really interesting and important point that I want to make sure everyone heard about. I would love to hear all of you expand on it. So you said you're developing, what the military wanted isn't necessarily what the investors want and where the market is, right? Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, that's true.
So could you all talk a little bit about how do you find that balance? How do you approach that balance? Because, none of these are going to come to market without commercial investors. So how do you quantify or build your business plan when you have to, meet a government contract for just this segment, which takes time, technology, resources? One could argue that could be a distraction from a larger thing. I mean, is that a real thing that you guys are experiencing?
It is. I'll go first, right? I mean, you just got to be scrappy, right? It comes right on down to that. Every single technology that we've developed that is core to our commercial value proposition was largely developed in the excess around where the focus was on the government contracts. And, we've generated about $30 million, $35 million of private investment for the purposes of some of these other things. But the solution itself requires 100 million more in order for us to get over the line and achieve that level of autonomy where we can stand on our own. Bringing in that kind of investment at this point in time it takes an entirely different value proposition. We start with generic sterile injectables, but everybody knows that that's a not very profitable place to be. So how do we then influence investors that there's more there to be had? We take the innovations that we have and we try to go into other routes of administration and therapeutic modality. So we've taken our platform, we started the very earliest stages of expanding into biologics. And why are biologics important? Well, if you're following what the FDA just did, they no longer require in all places, a clinical trial to be run for biosimilar. Well, that's an easy place for us to enter next, easier than a lot of other places, but we have a number of things we need to do first, right? And so just be aware that when you're developing these technologies and you are thinking about your commercial customer versus your, military customer, the solution might look the same, but the need and the pressure points are really different, right? A hospital doesn't necessarily need to worry about, whether something could travel across an ocean, and be in various different temperatures, pressures, and humidities and perform exactly the same way with the military cares, right? And so that's how you have to try to think about your product in the context of solving different solutions.
Yeah, I think maybe I haven't done other industries, so I can't speak to what I'm not doing, right? But unique to the dual use is you have to be able to work and manage myriads of stakeholders, right? I mean, even the end user isn't the customer, right? In the DoD, it's regulated environment both within and outside. So I mean, it's a lot of balancing. I think a couple kind of principles I've realized in doing this is, you can't run two directions at the same time. You can't have two priorities. So we are here to save lives. We're here to be at the bleeding edge of trauma, and that's going to happen in the warfighter domain. Is it more profitable? Blah 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 blah. That's actually not the most important thing. I think we are centered and focused on chasing the value and the impact, because we know the scale is there. Anecdotally, there's clinically, it's there, right? So the second point then is we made sure to have, as our investors come on board, we have an aligned team that everyone knows, this is the priority. We have networks with EMTs and hospitals and all the other, the dual use markets. That's a secondary market that's ready, it's nascent, it's ready to go. But I think one thing we've done is we've aligned our operational plan to go after the priority, which for us is the military. And the third part about that is, even before I was in engineering school, I love what I call the frugal engineering. So basically the building things without sensors and Bluetooth and AI, and this is a problem, for instance, AI isn't going to solve. But because you get, I think you get efficiencies in engineering, doing more with less. These are real things. So while it is annoying and very expensive and a bit excessive to build a infinitely small and cheap but super reliable thing that will always save your life in the dark, one-handed, with two fingers every day, that's an efficiency that translates to the other markets, right? So when we translate this to law enforcement, to EMS, to global health, other markets internationally, those are efficiencies that we've eked out that we will leverage, right, to kind of further the value in other markets. So in that way, we've been actually pretty lucky, and we've seen it not as a tug of war, but it's a harder customer, it's a hard problem, it's a harder path, but it has the most reward, and it is it is the right way, right? So it can be harmonized in some ways, and I think in other markets for other technologies, different set of challenges to balance.
Thank you for sharing that. So, coming into the conversation, again, I've never commercialized dual use technology. I've worked with a couple, but back in my mind, I was like, well, if the government's kind of sponsoring it, and investors would probably love that. But what I'm hearing is like there's a whole other layer of challenges, a whole other layer of communication and kind of positioning that you need to kind of build into this.
I think you have to be careful, because as startups, what differs us from academia is we're laser focused, right? Sometimes you forget that and you start chasing contracts. And that is the biggest mistake that I have. You can go get $25-30 million in contracts, just go to one of these conferences and SRS, and I know people that have gotten so much money from that. But in the end, you have 12 projects. None of them is getting that call from the consumer, right? And this is the biggest issue. So if you want to go after VC money, you need to be focused. You have to know exactly, the government can push, but the consumer has to pull for you to be successful, especially in medtech where we are.
Yeah.
If you look at the market size for military is about 2% of the total market that we're going after. So if I go and present myself as a death tech company, of course, I'm not going to be as sexy as the other companies that are talking about much bigger problems, right? But if you find the balance between government contracts, what the market actually needs, what your customer discovery has said, what VCs are looking for, what is hot these days, that's when you're able to get enough money. I think Jeff Lang had told us once back in the day, he was with DARPA, he said, we can only push so much, but the market has to be the driving, pulling force for your technology to get in there.
Yeah, I would just like to add to that. There's different types of government contracts, right? Government-sponsored research and development is great when you're early on trying to conceive your solution and gain momentum behind its strength. But government procurement contracts are really what we're talking about, right? That's how do you take that research and development contract and convert it into a procurement contract. And I will tell you that at least the first several years of on-demand pharmaceuticals, there was this belief it was field of dreams, right? Like if you build it, they will come. And the practical reality is that this isn't an issue that the military wants available every day, day in and day out, everywhere. They want to be able to turn it on and off when they need it. And as a result, when I came in 2023, the very first thing we had to do is acknowledge that, a government procurement contract wasn't going to be the first foot in the door. We had to build a value proposition for it to be commercialized first, and then the government to feed from it thereafter, and then set up a few other pharmacies on demand thereafter. But it's distinguishing, and without getting distracted. I think early on, we focused on any contract we can get that the government needed that was, somewhat close to what we wanted to do, but it wasn't bang on point. And that happens all the time. So I'll leave it at that.
That's great. Well, I do want to leave a little bit of time for questions before we break, and you guys know they're going to stick around, so you have plenty of time to talk to them there. But while we have a captive Henry Jackson Foundation audience, when you look back on your dual-use startup journey, if you had a magic wand, what's one thing that they could embed into their innovation ecosystem that you think would have helped you along the way? We'll leave you with a hard one.
I don't want to. Every startup, this is a bit cliche, but every startup complains about not enough money, right? And that's true. We live in a resource-constrained environment. I think, and similar, we've had a lot of issues just with capital. Do we have enough of outside private capital stack to continue moving things forward, despite having multiple contracts on this other side of the fence, right? So if I can wave a wand, I think the connective tissue that Interjackson is forming and is championing is critical. But that piece, which is what's attempted to be done, right, needs to include investors, and there needs to be Sherpas or translators or guides or just folks who speak both languages. I think you need to have VCs and investors, need individuals who are CPAs and who can speak both languages and wear both hats. And I think it's just critical, to have that. And I think even from a national pride, national security, I think, patriotism, there also needs to be, I think there could be more of a push from the government side. And I've seen more of this recently to, I think, see or count some of this as a patriotic obligation, right? In terms of we do need to support, our families, our war fighters, their families, this community, both here and abroad. And so if I could wave wands, those are two elements. I think it's just underlining the importance of the mission, and that this translates beyond the military to things here at home. And then also, again, more capital, kind of sophisticated capital connective tissue needs to be, in the community. So
I think you hit the nail on the head, quite honestly. For me, it's about building that community. We find in our organization that the knowledge we need sometimes isn't, it isn't every day, but it's most of the time or some days. And it's hard to build a panel of advisors that can get you everything you need every day. And so being that connective tissue, finding those Sherpas out there, I love the way you described it, because I think that's the number one thing where we've struggled. We've hired people at times that had a very deep, specific interest and capability, but we didn't need their deep, specific knowledge day in and day out every day. And that becomes challenging because you can build a very robust and expensive, company that way and not necessarily use the resources that you have optimally. And so if there could be some more of that connective tissue, some more of that community building, events like this are perfect for that. So please continue to think about that. But it's really bringing together key deep knowledge experts and building a panel of resources that could be used by the community or companies like ours or even yourselves, right? And so whether it's inside of the Department of War or in the community setting among entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll say the biggest mistake I've done so far in my startup journey was listening to an advisor who told me, raise as much as you need and not more than that. I remember him telling me that money for a startup is not like oxygen. It's like food. No, it's not. I don't know what he told me. It's like food. So if you take too much, you die. He said that. That was 2021 when the market was hot, when I was fresh out of Y Combinator, like investors were getting in touch with us, and I stopped and I just raised enough to hit our milestones. But little did I know the market took a dive in 2022. So I think building a network of trusted advisors is very, very as startups, we get, I don't know what you guys want, like 50 emails a day from people soliciting their advice, and sometimes it's free, sometimes they want you to pay, and just you don't know how to listen to, especially like my case. I didn't even know I had to file for taxes. So just like looking at
I can help you.
I'll be fine.
That's good to know first.
But seriously, like I had no idea.
Go away.
Yeah, so just knowing who to trust. I think Petco has been very good at that. And, generally, that'd be important.
Great. Well, thank you all. I really appreciate that. We have some time for a couple of questions. So is everybody? Bill?
I'm Bill Kearns from Magenta. I have a question for the panel and also investors in the audience, and what's the thought process involved in providing capital to companies that they're involved in government contracts in this day and age where contracts can be canceled like that?
So speaking of stories, so we just got a contract, and it was like half for us, half for Cornell. And we just heard that Cornell is butting heads with the administration, so they canceled the contract. So you can never trust that anymore, unfortunately. You have to build your network of investors who have your back, who believe in your mission. So like in our case, we just got in touch with a couple of our investors and, didn't die. Yeah, I mean, everything is going to solve these days.
I would just add that it's about value inflection points, right? Like I made reference a number of times to the fact that some of the contracts we've taken haven't always been bang on point with what we wanted to be, but they moved us further down the road. Two recent examples of that. So we've been working on a government contract that uses highly modified wheat germ extract inside of our proprietary technology to produce a biologic. Well, that's not going to mean that next week we're going to be able to produce insulin, but that government contract is proving something and de-risking the investment for investors so that we can broaden our therapeutic modalities. And so that is one perfect example. Another one, we've been working on an Office of Naval Research project for cisatracurium. We don't want to produce cisatracurium. The market is flooded with it. It's not really necessary right now, but for those of you who were in the medical practice during COVID, you might know that cisatracurium is used to paralyze the esophageal tract. And in the absence of it, you cannot intubate a patient safely and efficaciously. And so there were a number of cocktails that were conceived and devised, but none of them were good enough at paralyzing the esophageal tract. And if you recall, there was this harvesting of ventilators. We couldn't get enough of them. And then all of a sudden we realized we had lots of them. We couldn't do jack with them. Why? We couldn't intubate patients. So the contract we've been working on most recently is for us to not only have the capability of making the active pharmaceutical ingredient for cisatracarium. No one is doing it in the United States today. But filing a drug master file with the FDA, which we did in May, and then conceiving a process and actually executing on it to produce that medication at the point of care at the level of quality that the FDA would acknowledge as sufficient for a drug approval for an ANDA. And so that's like 2 examples I can give you for like my investors are, why the hell are you doing cisatracarium? Nobody needs that. No, it's about moving the platform forward, right? When it comes to what we're doing with wheat germ extract, that seems illogical in light of the fact that we're trying to launch our distributed manufacturing platform for sterile injectables, generic drugs right now, because the future of where we're trying to move is aligned with what that contract can do for us. And it's just one step that you're constantly trying to progress.
I'd say simply, I think you have to formulate and pitch a robust plan, right? I mean, so you have to don't undervalue risk, don't undervalue raising as much money as you can. And I think you have to honestly, I mean, the plan has to be diversified enough to take hits on both sides. So, we're kind of military forward, but we do have a dual use, very bought in to the dual use, I think market and opportunity because it's tremendously big, right? And that plan, having both of those halves, half of our money has come from investors and half has come from the government, as it were. That wasn't the plan, but it's a good partnership. I think, being anti-fragile, right? I think you just got to pitch and formulate strong of a strategy as you can so that you can survive some thumps and bumps and, some bad news.
I would also say it goes back to, being passionate, but not being in love with your solution, as was indicated earlier. Our investors are constantly challenging, are we making the right investments of our people all the time? Like, are these the things we want them to learn by virtue of this contract for the business we're trying to build? And it's really about that moldable clay. I think that goes a long way because when you earn the credibility of your investors, it does open up doors to others in their community.
Yeah, great. Any other questions?
Thank you.
It's just it seems like you've created a currency from clarity and you're beachheading and can you speak on the discernment of that in hindsight from someone that's looking to,
Yeah. So for us, we think about it in the context of risk. It's the probability of technical, regulatory, and commercial success, right? And so along that entire journey, we needed to prove the technical success of some of our capabilities, whether it was manufacturing something or whether it was, proving the stability of something. All along that channel, as we were ticking off those boxes for probability of technical success, we were thinking about, well, what are we going to have to do in order to gain regulatory acceptance? Because you can't gain access to the market unless you have regulatory infrastructure in place. And that's a place where you have to really have a sophisticated understanding of all of the different pressure points from a regulatory perspective. This goes back to, having a panel of advisors rather than, 3 or 4 people on a staff sometimes could be a lot more cost accommodating. So I plea to you, think about how you can help in that interstitial space. But, as we went forward and we ran our pilot in Tupelo, Mississippi, when we were producing those 12,000 units of medication, we did so at a level of standard that was far beyond what 797 compliance under the U.S. Pharmacopoeia would require. We did it at GMP level. And why we did that is because we knew going forward, we wanted to file an ANDA. We wanted to be a CMO, CDMO. It's all about that value chain and building value inflection points along the line. It's never straightforward. There's always these offshoots, and you have to be thinking multidimensionally. But for us, it was risk of probability of technical success, probability of regulatory success that would then lead us to the commercial success. And the only way we are not commercially successful. We have not launched our very first commercial pod. However, what we have been able to do is meet with tens of hospitals at this point, and we've got 7 MOUs signed, 6 with large hospital systems, 3 in this region, several throughout the country, and 1 wholesale distributor. And you might scratch your head and say, well, you said hospitals. Why would you throw a wholesale distributor in there? It's because every single pharmacy on demand that we produce has a ceiling capacity of manufacturing. And if we're putting something in rural Mississippi, it's never going to, it'll always produce more than what could be consumed in that region. How would we work to distribute it? So it's like, you got to think in these tangents sometimes, and it's all about putting together that strategy. I don't know if you love to play chess. I do. I lose all the time because I'm probably more risk tolerant than risk averse. But it's testing in those game theory, elements into how you succeed.
I was gonna say, it's almost like you're playing ping pong with yourself.
Yeah, well, yeah, 3D chess a lot of times. Ping pong with yourself.
Did you have a question there?
I was going to say, Matt, I mean, your story is very inspirational, and I've been following it for a little bit. And I would just say that, 40 years ago or 35 years ago, people laughed at a person that, started an internet company and thought it was a good idea to sell books. And they laughed at that person, but they were just trying to prove a new, amazing supply chain, direct to consumer, on demand tool. And it's one of the biggest companies in the world and highly successful. So I would just say, your business is inspiring. I'd say keep it up, and look forward to talking to you later.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a hard time to keep your chin up. I'll be honest. It's just a struggle, but we are gaining momentum. We've got the support of some really wonderful investors. That's another thing. Like, whether your business is just getting off the ground or 10 years old, it really is about those people who sit in your boardroom that ask you the tough questions and challenge you to think differently and expect more of you and of your people. I think that's the best thing you can do.
Great. Well, I want to, again, let's have a round of applause for today's panelists. And again, a special thank you to all of our sponsors for today, and to Henry Jackson Foundation for getting us all together, fostering. We heard the community, we heard network, we heard advisors quite a bit today. I heard some war stories, so there's clearly a need for what you guys are building. So again, thank you all for sharing your stories today, and I encourage everyone to stick around. We're going to be networking and have an opportunity to talk further with everybody. So thank you again. Appreciate it.